We both love talking about data protection, and it's an exciting topic for us, and it's good to see you're as excited about data protection as we are. My name is Alex Holmes, and I'm a Senior Manager of the Sovereignty and Strategic Infrastructure team in AWS. My team, you probably noticed from my accent, I'm not local, I'm from London, England. My team is a global team, and its role is to really help understand what is getting in customers' way from doing transformation and taking and understanding what's perhaps getting in your way and feeding that through into the engineering and service teams so we can help you continue to innovate. My background is actually I came from the UK government. I was responsible for the government's technology transformation strategy, so I've really felt some of those things in terms of getting in the way. And in my last couple of years in UK government before I joined AWS over 3 years ago was heading up cybersecurity strategy across the economy, where I tried to help the UK be more secure from a cybersecurity point of view, but also led some of our international negotiations at the International Telecommunications Union and within the EU on the Cybersecurity Act.
Right, and I'm Paul Ahlgren, Swedish, working as a principal security strategist for AWS, working in the public sector security team for EMEA. I have about 40 plus years in the industry, and more than 20 years in the financial services industry, and before I came to AWS, I was the chief solution architect for one of the major banks in Sweden. At AWS, I work mainly with compliance questions and getting all of the information that we have and all the technology that we provide to get data protection officers and legal to understand how to be able to use the cloud in its full capacity. And the group I'm working with, we also work with security strategy to help companies and organizations to increase the security and compliance posture. But today, and if you switch the picture, please.
To say, before we jump onto the agenda, some of the more eagle-eyed of you may have noticed the title has changed throughout the week. So initially, the title of this session was Navigate Data Protection in the EU with AWS. But we announced our digital sovereignty pledge on Sunday, just before reInvent. So we really wanted to expand the scope of this talk, and it meant there's more things we can talk about, and we'll go into that later.
Yes, and in the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk. We're going to start by setting a baseline on what we mean with data protection and digital sovereignty, because there are about as many opinions on what that is as there are people in this room. We're then going to go into a few of the most common questions we get and talk on how we work with these. And at the end, we're going to give you some hints on some resources that are available for you, and that since you're probably not a legal person if you're here, information that if you get questions from your legal, that you can provide information for them to read up on, etc. And why I say this is because GDPR and the privacy laws that come around the world, they have changed the playing field it's no longer that if you're a technician, you can just build the stuff. Today, you have to know things that are actually in the legal space. So it's the same kind of thing that 10 years ago, a developer didn't have to know anything about DevOps. Now you have to know about both the ops sides and the development side. And the world is changing, and the privacy laws around the world is going to be that interaction between technology and legal and business is going to get closer and closer. So next picture. So we are going to start by talking about digital sovereignty and data protection. And as I said, there are many views on this one. But if we take a look on the legs we have when we talk about digital sovereignty, it's where you have your data, where the data residency. Our customers want to know where is the data stored, where is it computed, what happens with it. It's also today that customers do want isolation between the operator access that we provide and their content. And we have going to talk about a number of things today that we do in that space, because and we say this often, that we believe that customer content is toxic. We do not want to get access to it. And in a number of cases, we have gone all the way so we cannot even theoretically get that kind of access. Digital sovereignty is also about resiliency. Ukraine is a good example today with how will you operate when you get invaded. And in their case, they have looked at things on that they have to move their digital infrastructure outside Ukraine so that they can still operate, even though that they cannot guarantee that the infrastructure is there. And that is why, for instance, the electricity system is still working in Ukraine, because they can do all the controls on systems that are running in the AWS cloud outside of Ukraine. So resilience is an important part of this, and also that operational autonomy, what happens so that I do not get influenced by third countries and other things. And we're going to talk about most of this today. But when we're talking about sovereignty, it very often comes down to that people want that 100% control that you have when you have the computer under your desk. You know where it is, you know who can get to it, etc. But they still want to do all of that public, what you can do in the public cloud. And here we have a thing where we are now trying to move those things you need for sovereignty so that you can still operate fully in the cloud.
And one thing I mentioned earlier was my team's role is to really understand what customers' needs and what they want. And when we speak to customers, of course, it's completely reasonable. They want control of their data. That's a great thing to want and to need. But when you also speak to customers, they say they want the full benefits, the full depth and breadth of the cloud, the flexibility, the innovation and security that comes with hyperscale cloud. Now, sometimes I think it's been presented, and if you think about some of those solutions on the last slide, these sovereign clouds, they've created almost a false dichotomy between innovation and flexibility and control. People don't want to sacrifice one for the other. And when we've been thinking about this in AWS and we brought it out in our pledge, we want to give people the benefits, the best of both worlds. And this is why in our pledge we announced our sovereign by design approach. Now, AWS has already, like many of our innovations, we've always thought about the cloud and how we can give customers control and sovereignty in our cloud. And what the pledge did is it expanded on that, and it went further in 4 key areas. And one thing I always love about AWS is we genuinely, we accept customers, we always want to challenge us, and we want to innovate on behalf of customers, but we genuinely think long term. So rather than perhaps delivering a short-term solution, something called a sovereign cloud, we want to put the investment and the effort into building sovereignty into our global infrastructure, make it sovereign design, and we have these 4 pledges around that we're going to go into a bit more detail in over. So control over the location of data, verifiable control over data access, the ability to encrypt everything everywhere, and then resiliency of the cloud. And you can see how those tie to both data sovereignty and digital sovereignty.
Yeah, and then one of my favorite pictures, and I don't know how many times you've seen this, but the shared responsibility model, especially in the security, data privacy, and the sovereignty space, is extremely important to understand. And if you're used to working with AWS, you also know that model is the wrong word. There are a number of models, and with, for instance, the KMS with external key store that we introduced earlier this week, you get another model on the responsibility of and in the cloud. And AWS have a responsibility of the security, of the compliancy, and the sovereignty of the cloud. But as soon as you start do things, you're in the cloud and it's your responsibility. And if you have seen different pictures for different services like S3, where you principally only have that responsibility for the content that you put in there and how you protect it, down to an EC2, where you still have to do all that patching and all that heavy lifting that is needed to keep it updated. So you know that the line on what AWS is responsible for and what you as the customer are responsible for differs. But the important thing with the shared responsibility model from my world is the thing you find on the top. The responsibility to securing the content that you store in the cloud, it's always yours. You cannot outsource that to a third party, which is us. We provide you the tools to do that, encryption, IAM, and other things, but you are responsible for securing the data that you put in the cloud for many reasons. So, and if we look at this picture, it has more to it than it actually, when you read this. The thing is that if you look into the Schrems II verdict in Europe, which is about data transfer outside the European Union or the EEA, and the GDPR, which is about protecting privacy, there are a number of things that you have to provide, always have to provide. You have to provide who has access to your data. We help you with that with the IAM and the IAM analyzer and other things, and the control tower that protects you against yourself, so to speak, and I will come back to that in a few slides. You also have to know who has had access to your data. We can't see what you do, for instance, in EC2s inside your account, but when you interact with the platform, that generates logs in CloudTrail, and you can use CloudWatch, and you can store these logs to ensure that you have that control. You can see who has accessed your data. You can see who has accessed your keys. So those kinds of tools are important for you. And then you have to protect the data. And all of our, now I think 117 services that store data has encryption built into it. You can also, of course, put your own encryption on top if you would like to do that. But that is, along with tokenization and other things, it's the most important tool you have to ensure that only the people that should have access to your data have access to your data. So, we state a lot, and if you read the Sovereignty Pledge, we state that we are doing things and that we're going to do things, and we state things on, for instance, that our HSMs, we cannot access the key material in those HSMs, and it's nice. And some of it is in the contract, but can you trust us? Well, you don't have to trust us in most cases, because we have a long number, and it's ever growing. It's growing with, I think, at least one new every second month. We have a number of certifications and attestations of third parties upon that we actually do what we say we do. So, for instance, KMS, which is a centerpiece in the data protection area, we have, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have 14 controls today in the SOC controls that you find. So that's the blue buttons that you see there in the middle of the picture. And we have 14 controls to give evidence that we cannot access key material. So certifications are useful for many reasons, and it's not a competition on having the most, because when you get, we do, but when you get to above a certain number, you start to repeat yourself. But it's very rare that we find and get the question that we cannot point to a third-party attestation.
And I think what we've been doing now is explaining how AWS is sovereign by design, and making sure we talk through our security and control baselines. And part of that story, I mean, the third-party attestations are so important. So if you think about those tools and services, we want to make sure that customers and you can have visibility and third-party audits that say that those tools do what we say they do. And another really important part of, I guess, of our posture today is security and controlling data and protecting data is a team sport. And so we have the largest community of partners of any cloud provider. And of course, you have those partners with the security competency who have deep experience in this and managed security service providers as well for ongoing security management. I always like to think of the role of partners, of analogy of someone who's learning to cook. And I come from the public sector. I'm very familiar with people who are just starting their cloud journey and they don't have that deep experience of using all those great tools and services that we provide to manage and control, manage and protect their data. So it's like someone starting to cook. So it's having the world's best supermarket available to you, and you have all these great ingredients, but you don't have the experience or the capability to turn that into a delicious meal. And this is where the partners with security competency, for example, can come in and help, and they have that experience, and they can help make a delicious meal for you, or in this case, protect your data. We also have some great programs like Authority to Operate, which is a program there to help partners think about how they can support customers with their compliance needs. We have programs and announcements that our partners have made. So for example, data protection as a managed service, which T-Systems have announced in Germany, which is guidance and that kind of managed service to help customers there manage their data. And of course, T-Systems have announced how they've integrated the external key store into that as well this week. Now, I'd be wrong of me to talk about AWS ClearStart.
I can say a few words. The thing with that we're also looking into is how can we combine these things with regulation. And in Sweden, we had the problem that the public sector were scared of the cloud, and they didn't really know how to ensure that they were following some central privacy and security laws in Sweden. So what we made was that we made and built upon the landing zone accelerator, as it's called today. We created a landing zone that also added a number of controls to ensure that right from the start they can use the cloud and be in compliance with some of the most central laws for public sector in Sweden. So,
and in the next section, we really the way we thought about this presentation was rather than just us present it, sovereign by design and how in AWS you can manage data and protect data. We wanted to base it on the really most difficult questions that we get and hear from customers and work backwards from that. So it's almost an interactive, frequently asked questions where we go through what we normally hear. And the first one that I hear a lot certainly is, can the US government see my data? And this question is sort of, I think, comes from different concerns and different drivers. Sometimes it's about privacy of their customers' data or the end user's data. Often it's a compliance concern, for example, with equivalency of GDPR in Europe. But other times it's perhaps more a broader concern around disclosure of data to foreign authorities. It's a really difficult question, so I'm going to ask Paul.
Yeah, and the problem with this area is that here we move into the space where technology is not enough. That you encrypt the data and that you have it stored correctly in your accounts may not be enough, because any company that stores data for a third party, they are subject to legal requests, in theory. And so here we come into that to be able to provide that completeness on sovereignty and on privacy, it's both technical, it's contractual, and it's organizational. And here we come to the contractual commitments that AWS makes to our customers. And for those in Europe and for your outside Europe, I'm sorry that we go a lot around what's happening in Europe, but it's They kind of lead the way on the privacy side at the moment, and we go further than the requirements of the GDPR and the Schrems II verdicts in the commitments that we make in the contract. We have a data processing addendum that is shared by all customers that provide how we process customer data. And that addendum has a supplementary addendum that handle legal requests where we make a commitment to challenge all requests, always point to the data controller, as it's called in GDPR, which is, in our case, it may be a SaaS provider or an end customer, but they will in their turn have to point to the data owner or the data controller. And we also have commitments on what we do in the case where we cannot point directly to the end user, or the end customer. We also provide information. This is information needed for legal risk assessments, and there the legal thing comes again, because these risk assessments have to be done by the data controller. So twice a year, we publish how many requests we get, where they come from, and if they are requests specifically, because this is a question that comes up a lot in Europe, we have a specific request a specific line stating how many times have requests from US government resulted in data being delivered out from outside the US, more or less. And the result, since we got that into that report in 2020, is a very nice and round number because it's 0. And people that are now European in the room and works with this and understands the kind of worry that is out there is to understand that we're spending an enormous amount of manpower and money on this problem, and it should be more risk-based. GDPR as a law is risk-based, so it's not a black and white law. It's always a risk reward thing. And people should look at this a little bit more, I think.
I think, I mean, that 0, that big fat 0, is a global number. And I think one of the beauties of thinking about sovereign by design is builders want to build. As a business, one of the benefits of cloud is you get to focus on delivering services and innovating and delivering better things to your customers and your end users. And what you don't want to be focusing on is compliance. And so this is a really good reference point that you can always give to your compliance teams in terms of, here is a data point. So since July 2020, the number of data requests that resulted in data being disclosed from outside the United States is 0. And of course, technology supports that as well. So we give you the ability to encrypt everything everywhere. All our services, you can encrypt things in transit, in rest, in memory. All our services support encryption, and most actually support encryption with customer keys inaccessible to AWS. I think a really important point about this is if you don't have the keys to decrypt data, then the data is unreadable by third parties, and that's important in thinking about that previous slide as well. And of course, along with AWS KMS, where you can manage the keys, we also have single tenant solution, Cloud HSM. And this week we announced AWS KMS external key store XKS. So if you also want to manage your keys in a hardware security module on premise outside of the AWS cloud, you now can, and you can interact through AWS, into AWS through an API. Do you want to go into a bit more detail on that?
Yeah. One of the things, and I get this a lot, I mean, we provide a few different solutions around KMS and Cloud HSM, and in KMS, you can either use that managed key store that you share with other customers, or you can bring your own key by injecting keys into KMS, or you can have a dedicated Cloud HSM that provides that key store for you, or now you can have an external key store. The important thing to understand, because this is, I get people that think that the ones that are outside the regular or what we call vanilla or native KMS, that they provide more security. This is not the case. Regardless of the KMS solution that you use, they are going to give you the same level of protection against AWS, for instance. The reasons why there are different solutions are that due to regulatory requirements, you may have to do it a certain way, and we have provided different solutions for that. But the thing with KMS is that it's built in a way so that keys are never exposed, and there is no operator access for us, even in the managed key store, so that we can get to the key material. And if we want to update, we have to completely tear the machine down so that we exclude the key material, and then we can do that update. And it has to be done by several people. And this is for people that have read, for instance, in those SOC control that says that no single AWS individual, etc. It's part of the FIPS requirements that if you do certain actions on the HSM, you have to have, and I do not know the names of the different roles, but there are 2 different roles that you have to do so that you cannot do it yourself. And we do all this, and as I already stated a few times now, we do have a number of controls. We have the FIPS for the HSMs that are backed, and then we have a number of SOC controls for KMS to show that we cannot manipulate keys or using the API to decrypt information, even if we would like to.
So encryption's a really important part of that answer when you're thinking about can third-party access data. And we've gone over today how the AWS cloud is taking a sovereign by design approach to give you control over data and encryption of data. Now in the pledge, we've started talking about what we're doing in the future. So we want to continue to innovate and invest in additional controls, particularly around encryption. Now, I know these pledges are forward-looking statements and they don't have particular dates on them, but this one is a really good example of where we have said we will continue to innovate and offer a service that allows you to manage keys outside of the AWS cloud. Now, this pledge was made on Sunday, and then this week we then made AWS KMS external key store generally available. So that shows how we're really committed to delivering on these pledges, and that capability, some of that capability has already been delivered this week. So another question I hear a lot is, and this comes back to that idea of if you're a builder, if you're responsible for delivering a service to end users, you don't want to worry about the details of compliance. And customers sort of say, I just want to know I'm going to be compliant. Can I be compliant using AWS? It's a very broad question, but I think it's a really good one. And Paul, you're going to talk about how you can demonstrate to your compliance teams how to support that.
Yeah, and one thing that is important is that you can never be compliant just by running on AWS. Because we come back to the shared responsibility model. To be compliant is a number of things where the infrastructure you run on has to be compliant. And that is where, for instance, our certifications come in. So if you're working in the financial services industry, you probably heard about the PCI compliance, which is a really tricky one. And there we can help by saying that the infrastructure you run on, that will help you being compliant. But on top of that, you will have to see that your solution is compliant and that your processes are compliant. So that is why when we get the question, can I be GDPR compliant on AWS? Yes, you can, but you will have to do work. But we support all these standard and compliance certifications, and both for all over the world, so FedRAMP and NIST are American-based standards. GDPR is regulation in Europe. C5 and CISP are certifications. C5 is a very good one if you want to actually read up on what we do, because it's very clear. And you have most of the controls that you see in the other certifications as well. And it's available to you if you have access to the console, because most of our certifications are available through something called AWS Artifact. And anyone that has console access can also download the latest certifications and reports. And the last thing you see there, CISPE, I'm actually going to leave that over to you, but it's really one of the more interesting things that we have today.
Yeah, so it's, and actually we had an icon showing CISPE earlier on as well. So CISPE is a CISPE Code of Conduct is a standard across Europe that shows that the services go above and beyond GDPR. We announced that we had 48 services that were compliant with CISPE back in February this year, and we've expanded the number of services to 100 a couple of weeks ago. And actually, this is attested and certified by CNIL, who are the French Data Protection Authority. So it's a really good demonstration of when you're speaking with your compliance teams of these are the services you may be using, and they as a service, go above and beyond the GDPR requirements. And
yeah, and just before reInvent, we added 48 new services, and there are now 100 services that are CISPE certified.
And if we, again, and it's some of the, the compliance links to part of one of the pledges as well. So for some, in some sectors, and telco is one that comes to mind particularly, and this links to digital sovereignty element of sovereignty. So not just about controlling data, but sort of being able to manage the resilience of the infrastructure that's sitting on it. So today we pledged, and again, very important for telco operators, so early in the week, we pledged that we want to enhance our range of resilient options. And here we're not just talking about some of our options in terms of edge computing like Outpost and the Snow family. We're always thinking about that sovereign by design and the capability that sits in our region capability. We want customers who are using regions to be able to sustain operations through whether they're disrupted or disconnected, whether that's through political, natural disaster, or technical means. So a really important part of the pledge as well.
Yeah, and another question we get a lot is what kind of access do we have to customer data? This is an area I could speak for hours, but the thing to make it short is everything you know on how to run data centers, you need to forget that. And AWS is not a managed service provider. We get questions like, well, your support must have customer access. And the answer to that is no. Because we do not work as a managed service provider. We do not have that kind of access as a managed service provider. We cannot see into the customer accounts like a managed service provider. But Alex, a little about access to data.
So we have a page, actually I'll refer to it a couple of times in our data protection center called Privacy Features of AWS. And at the top of the page, as is quite very clear and I think really useful statement that goes beyond our customer agreement around we prohibit and we have systems designed to prevent, and this goes into some of the operational processes around data protection, remote access by AWS personnel to customer data, including for routine service maintenance, and that's quite an important aspect. But actually, I appreciate this has caveats in this statement, and I also appreciate this is saying we will not access data, and I think what we really want to think about is, can we have a situation where we can't access data?
And then we come to one of the coolest things we actually have in the AWS cloud, and that is the Nitro platform that helps customers, and it is the way that if you use the Nitro platform, AWS cannot see what you do on the compute. We do not have operator access to the virtualization host where you run your virtual machines. We cannot dump memory. We simply cannot have access. It's technically built away. And when Nitro was created, it had two purposes. There were probably a lot more, but when you listen to the presentations around Nitro, there are two things they really wanted to do. First of all, if you do regular virtualization like you normally do, a lot of the compute power goes away or goes to waste to run the host where you run your virtual machines. But when Nitro was created, they also wanted to look into the security aspect. And after a number of years, and we had this for several years, so it's nothing new, but after a couple of years, we had this that we were completely isolated from the customer's EC2 machines. And so if you take the next one, and it's built of the interesting thing of that when you do virtualization, you move things out to hardware again, which is I always find a bit funny that you run virtualization with hardware. And these chips, they are made in a way so that this is the only way we can communicate to the virtualization hosts. And it's API driven, there are no backdoors, there are no SSH possibilities or anything. And that makes Nitro one of the gold pieces into the sovereignty pledge and how you can expect us to look at these things going forward.
And I mean, Paul said it's really cool and impressive. I think it's one of the most underappreciated capabilities within AWS. I'd really put it up there with serverless computing because it completely rethinks how the virtualization and hypervisor works. We're not the experts on it, and we're not going to try and talk through the detail. And actually, last week, a really good white paper was published, and here's the QR code for it, that goes into detail about how it works and how we're just separating the control plane from the data plane, so people and operators in AWS can't access customer data. So it's not enough. This is us going beyond saying we won't access it, and we have the processes not to access it. This means we can't access the data. And this links to the pledge, because that is sovereign by design today. We have Nitro system across and underneath a number of services, and within our pledge, we want to keep expanding that capability, keep expanding that idea of we can't access the data, rather than this, we won't access the data. And you'll see in this pledge, it's very similar to that statement I put up a couple of slides ago, but in this case, actually, there's no caveats to it. It is just blankly saying we want to limit all access to customer data unless requested by a customer or a partner you trust.
And then we come to one of the more important questions, and that is, where is my data and who can move it? AWS do not, as a general rule, you're going to talk about a few things where it can be moved, but AWS do not move data from where you store and compute it. You are in full control of where that is going to happen. So let's go through this a little bit.
So first, of course, we want to start with our global infrastructure and our global approach. We now have 30 regions and 96 availability zones. Actually, I had to keep updating this slide because in the last month, we announced 3 more regions in Spain, Switzerland, and India. And actually, we also have a number of local zones. So we doubled the number of local zones outside of the US this week. So we announced 4 new local zones in Helsinki, Copenhagen, Buenos Aires, and Muscat. That was the 4th one.
Good.
And as Paul was saying, with our sovereign by design approach, we give you full control over your data, and it stays in the region that you've selected. Unless we're required to move it for fraudulent abuse purposes or to meet law enforcement requests, which we've already talked about.
A small point before you go on there. Yeah, is also, you know this, but from a data protection point of view, the region is important because the region is always situated within one country. And that means that if you place data in Frankfurt, you can be sure that the data will stay in Germany. Or if you place it in Sydney, it will be in Australia. And this is an important concept of how we have built the cloud.
And that privacy features page I mentioned earlier, also has a very helpful table on it. So often I think people think about in terms of residency control and data access. So this table here very explicitly states, as well as a number of other privacy features for each service, it lists all the services and quite helpfully has a tick against the list there that there is no remote access. So no one is accessing that data from outside the region. It also helpfully has very explicitly the few services where that doesn't fully apply. So for example, the small number of services, there's 7 actually, where international transfer of data is part of the operation of the service. For example, content delivery, so CloudFront, or services, and there's 11 of these, which are machine learning, artificial intelligence services, where data is part of improving the algorithm and improving the quality of the service. But actually, in all of those, you can opt out of all of 11 of those services, and actually you can introduce guardrails to ensure that no one in your environment is accidentally opting in on them as well.
It's part of the service control policies.
Exactly. And actually, talking of guardrails.
Yes, and the thing is that now we told you that we do not move your data unless you actually instruct us to do it. But you also want to make sure that you do not move the data by mistake. And Control Tower contains a number of guardrails that ensures that you cannot, for instance, start resources in the wrong region, or that you at least inside AWS, you cannot copy data to the wrong place. If you copy it outside or back to your on-prem, that we can't help you with. But Control Tower contains a number of things that you can add to ensure that not only AWS do the right thing, but actually you do the right thing.
And you may have noticed the structure of our presentation now. And of course, around this area, this is the 4th commitment, the 4th sovereignty pledge. So we've talked about some of the residency controls you have today, and these go alongside data access controls. We're going to expand these residency controls. Today, and that privacy features list is actually a list of services, and it always refers to customer content, so data that you are putting into the cloud. Here, we want to expand, and I think this is really important. Yeah. That control over data that we use and we manage the cloud with, so operational data, sometimes referred to as metadata, identity data, so for example, data that's being used in how our AWS Identity and Access Management Service, IAM, is working, and also billing information. So at the moment, we have a global billing platform, but you can see here, we really want to give you residency control and choose the region or the location of how that billing is managed. So none of the metadata is leaving your territory or jurisdiction. So this goes well above and beyond what is required by GDPR, because this is data that we use as a data controller, but we want to give those extra controls. So hopefully, well, I'm sure you found this helpful. We've gone over what we think are the most difficult questions we hear. We've gone over the detail of some of the pledges, and I think we've really pulled out the bits of the pledges that I think show the level of investment and commitment we're making that sometimes I think could have been missed in the overall blog that Matt Garman published. Another way of looking at it is, and I think Paul mentioned this earlier, there are different ways that aspects of managing and controlling your data. So first you have those technical measures, those tools and services we provide. Then in addition to that, you have those process measures. So this includes third-party audits and attestations that those tools and services are doing what they say they are, and of course our own internal processes. And then because these things are true, we are happy to back them up with contractual measures as well, not only to challenge requests, but also within a customer service agreement, we back that up with the contract.
Yeah, and we're going to leave you with a couple of resources, because I'm sure after everything that has happened at reInvent that you still have plenty of time to read a lot of stuff. But this is information that is useful for doing that practical work. So we hope it's hard to read on the screen. I see some of you taking pictures, but the presentation will be provided in one way or the other afterwards. But we have information, and to be frank, I have a document with 8 pages on it with just links around this topic with information from AWS, because it's a complex topic. We have 250 different services, and we have millions of customers doing things differently. But if you want to read up on data protection, you see up there in the corner to the right for you, you see that the Data Protection Hub and the EU Data Protection Hub. There you find a couple of interesting white papers on how to navigate GDPR compliance, how to navigate data protection. There are also other interesting white papers on, for instance, logical separation and isolation of tenants and things like that. So there are a lot of things to read up upon if you're interested. And if you like cryptography, there is the cryptographic details on KMS, which is a good read if you understand cryptology. I do not say that I do. So there are a lot of material. The tough part, and I say that up front for you, is that it's the amount of material available for you. It can be hard to find, but look at the central white papers, because they give you the possibility to move forward looking to more detailed resources.
And we want to make this as, AWS always wants to make this as easy as possible for builders to build, and you focus on your business and meeting your end users' needs. We couldn't fit all the QR codes for all those white papers on there, but we have got the QR code for the Digital Sovereignty Pledge, which I think is really good, and it goes into some of that detail around, and we've gone into highlighted some of the key points there of how we continue to expand on our sovereign by design approach. So you don't have to sacrifice all the benefits you get of the hyperscale cloud with that control over data that we know you need and you want. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to complete the session survey in the mobile app. We have a bit of time, so we'll take questions and feedback actually in things which you think AWS isn't doing enough of today when it comes to digital sovereignty. We can take those questions and discussion outside. But thank you so much.
Thank you.